Welcome to Lead Up Podcast. I'm your host and publisher, Mike Harbour, and this is the Elite Leadership Series. And today, I'm really excited to bring a new guest on the show today. I'm joined by a veteran healthcare executive who understands the heavy weight of operational leadership in healthcare today. Richie Splitt has led in the healthcare industry as a CEO for over 25 years. His most recent CEO job was the CEO of Norman Regional in Norman, Oklahoma. He's also the recent author of a book called The Healer Revolution. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see a copy of that I'm holding up now, but it's a deeply disruptive new book for our industry. The title is The Healer Revolution: How to Restore the Soul of Healthcare. And as we talk about restoring the soul of healthcare leadership on this podcast a lot, his forward features none other than Quint Studer, who's been a mentor for both Richie and myself and many other healthcare leaders as well. Richie, I'm really excited to have this conversation with you today and talk about subjects that are deeply important to both of us, as we talked about in our pre-show conversation. Welcome to the Lead Up Podcast.
Thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really grateful for the opportunity and look forward to our conversation today.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. The goal, as we discussed, Richie, a few weeks ago, is to serve the industry, right? That's what your book does. And the goal of the podcast is to serve leaders in the industry who are looking for answers in an industry that it needs that disruption today more than ever. We've got major challenges from workforce, economic challenges, staffing challenges, all of those things today. But I want to get into your story first before we go into some of those current challenges. You've led in some large organizations. In Richie's book, he talks about his second day on the job as a CEO in Moore, Oklahoma, a Cat 5 tornado ripping through the Oklahoma City area. And Richie, I remember that day as well. I live in the tornado belt like you in Arkansas, and those are all scary days. But Richie talks about that. He also talks about being in the healthcare industry during the Oklahoma City bomb. He's also led through the epidemic or the pandemic of COVID. And so there's a lot of challenges that Richie has led through, and those impact our organization, Richie. But here's what I want to ask you. How do you manage, or as a leader, how did you manage the mental, the emotional, the spiritual energy to really maintain a balanced leadership state without burning yourself out? And then we'll get into your team as well.
That's a real challenge, especially in today's healthcare environment. It's really easy, especially as CEO, to assume the ownership and the responsibility for everybody in the organization, every direction of the organization. And so it would be easy for anyone, any leader, to assume that weight. So I think what's really important and what helped me tremendously, and I think might help others as well, is the discipline of staying focused on the purpose. So there are many things. We can tilt at windmills all day. We can ponder the effect of AI in our organization, what it's going to do, how it will potentially transform the work that we deliver. We don't have all the answers there, but we could literally tilt at that AI windmill all day long and not have much of an answer, a solution in the end. So what I always tried to do was remain calm and return to the discipline of purpose. Why are we here? And in healthcare, we're here to serve the patient, to restore the brokenness in the lives of those that seek our help. And that was really important for me, is, again, to always remember our purpose. And that started for me many years ago when I walked into healthcare for the first time as a physical therapy technician, and just found it a real privilege to be able to sit knee to knee or walk shoulder to shoulder with patients, learn about them, and help them on their journey to restoration.
I forgot about that in our pre-conversation, Richie. Our careers started very similarly. You and I both are former college athletes. Richie was a former Division I college wrestler. We're going to get on the mat and wrestle a little bit today in our conversation, Richie. But we also started our career on the front lines of leadership. I too was a physical therapy assistant when I started in healthcare. That wasn't my first job. I was actually a mental health orderly, working weekends, giving friends drugs and feeding them and trying to keep them from killing each other or killing me. So, that was my first foray into healthcare. But I want to this is where I want to get on the mat with you a little bit. I warned you of this in the email to you,
Sure.
Richie, that want to wrestle a little bit. What let's talk about the specific cost to you as a leader, physically, emotionally. Where did and where does capacity tend to fail, or where did it fracture in your leadership at times? Because I really my goal is to give leaders who are maybe right there in some of those challenges now to realize that failure is a part of the process, right? It's a part of getting better, part of learning,
Sure.
part of growing. And so you want to point people back to purpose, but where did you struggle in doing that?
There were many struggles along the way, and I had to be eyes wide open. You mentioned in my book, I talk about the Oklahoma City bombing, where the Oklahoma Standard was really revealed, and the turmoil, the challenges, the hurt, the pain that we all experienced. And so I watched the leaders, I watched my coworkers. Again, as a physical therapy technician, I wanted to learn, I wanted to be there, I wanted to be present, I wanted to be strong for others, especially the patient. And so, again, as I mentioned, you assume the responsibility for the hurt and the healing. And I shared in the organization quite often that I view it as my goal, responsibility, as well as the rest of the organization to stand in the gap between the hurt and the healing. And when we do that, again, if we don't have that release, then we are going to shoulder a burden that is just unsustainable. You think about the lives that we touch each and every day in healthcare, some of the happiest times, some of the saddest times, first breath, last breath, all of those things. The constraints of healthcare today, whether it's reimbursement or changing policy, changing administrations, a pandemic, whatever it is, that's a lot of responsibility to assume responsibility for and to work through. I cannot do it alone. You cannot do it alone. None of us can do it alone. So we have to rely. What I did was rely on others. I watched, again, early in my career, I watched leaders, how they responded and reacted. That calm confidence that they brought to chaotic situations really settled me. It inspired me. And I took note of that. That's how I want to be as a leader. That's what I always strived to do as an athlete, is to never be rattled and to overcome any difficult challenges. And in healthcare, those challenges come routinely every hour, several times in an hour. And we seem to be geared for those chaotic crisis situations. But the bigger challenge is, how do you manage beyond it? You had the crisis on Monday, but how do you return to ordinary experiences on Tuesday when a crisis is over? And so finding opportunities to connect with others, to really be present and vulnerable to them and with them, recognizing, naming those challenges, those are all vitally important things in healthcare today, and recognizing that we are not superheroes. They say, especially during the pandemic, that not all heroes wear capes, and that's true. But we also don't have those superpowers to just shed those concerns and the injury that comes from what we live each and every day.
Yeah, that's so good. We're going to circle back to purpose in a minute. I want to go a little bit deeper on this discussion we're having. But we as healthcare leaders, especially C-suite leaders, we're conditioned to project absolute, unshakable certainty, right? I'm a big believer, calm is contagious. I have no doubt about that in leadership. I'm someone who's always run to the danger and tried to calm things down and provide direction. Some of that is just training growing up. Maybe as an athlete, I was an Army medic. You learn to control emotion and maybe direct traffic in crazy situations. But in those moments, you've had some of those moments, right? Maybe even your recent transition from Norman Regional, there's emotional toll that it can take on us. And we can't always lean into maybe someone on our team, right? Or in your case, the board. So show weakness. Who do you lean into in those moments? And how do you, because there's a lot of talk about authentic or transparent leader today, but we can't always be truly authentic and transparent with someone on our staff, right? So talk about that a little bit. Since you're not in that role anymore, now, where did you go? Who'd you lean into? How did you handle that emotional release you certainly have to go through?
Me, it always has been the grace of God. And so I find that comfort in those moments, the hardest, most difficult, the most joyous, all of those moments, I try to give over to Him. So my faith plays a significant part a very meaningful part of who I am as a person and who I am as a leader. I also have my wife, and without her, I could never have achieved what I did as a leader, what I have done as a leader. Her support, my family's support, but going first to God and seeking guidance and seeking that comfort and owning my mistakes, owning that vulnerability. That's one of the things that I had to learn as a leader too. It's lonely at the top and people are watching, always watching. And that calm that you mentioned, that calm confidence that I talked about, it's extremely important. It's also detectable when it's not real. And so that's another thing that I learned as well as a leader is when you don't know, share that. When you are concerned, share that. When you have fear, share that in appropriate ways. But we don't have to have all of the answers as leaders. And that vulnerability, I think, draws us closer one to another and then allows us to achieve some remarkable things as a result. You're building trust, you're building that confidence. You have many minds that you invite into the solution finding opportunities. So I really believe that my faith gives me my strength. Those around me give me opportunities to build from there. And I always seek their guidance. I try to seek their guidance as much as possible and then find that path forward.
Yeah, that's really good. I think that's so important in today's world. I feel I'm a man of faith like you. I feel like we're slowly coming back to a spiritual direction in some of the areas. Healthcare was founded by the faith, the faith industry, right?
Mhm.
And we've gotten away from that a little bit, and it's become such a business, which is where I
It
want to
has.
transition to now, right? We frequently we find that the primary bottleneck in a thriving culture isn't the front lines, it's the C-suite, where executives get trapped in thinking about the KPIs and the bottom
Sure.
line and the spreadsheets and the measurements that we have to do, that we have to measure. And look, I'm a results-oriented guy. I was a contributor in a book called From Heart to Head and Back Again, which is all about
Mm.
heart-based leadership.
Yeah.
I try to teach and coach leaders how to be highly relational because and again, Richie, just coming from a guy who's very task and results oriented. How many hits did I get? How many people did I pin to the mat? Whatever, however you want to frame it, right? But your book outlines a bold vision to returning to this healer culture, right? Or maybe a faith-based culture. How do you take a traditionally clinical, margin obsessed executive team and shift? What's the thinking, the behaviors, the attitude that has to shift in their daily operational habits to align with this heart centered philosophy? Because that's
Yeah.
really what I want to get into with you today.
That's a really challenging question. And I would say to you, in my book, I talk about how the healer culture that we built in the healer revolution was a plane that we built as we flew it. I didn't come in with a blueprint. I didn't come in and say, this is exactly what we are going to do. It was revealed to me from the rubble of that tornado that you mentioned in Moore, Oklahoma. Every person doing a role, a task, focusing on safety, the patient, their coworkers. It didn't take a title for a security officer to coordinate transferring or movement of patients. It didn't take a title or a policy for a housekeeper to serve in the same capacity as a chaplain in that moment of need. So from that rubble, these healers were revealed to me as I arrived on the scene. And so throughout that journey, the healer culture that we created, identity was invited, but those behavioral values were non negotiable. So we invited people to be a part of what became a healer or healer culture. And we built it around the values that were vitally important to the organization that gave us our true north. And so that was one thing I would say is that without that blueprint, it was organic and it was infectious in a positive way. And before you knew it, we were embracing that identity, embracing that shared purpose. And so for me, it was a little more passive to this endpoint, this healer culture that I talk about. So in an organization, I didn't have to hold up a policy and you will think this and you will do this. Simply talked about the values and their importance, talked about our mission, talked about our vision, and solicited input and solicited feedback and solicited buy in. And we were able to drive those remarkable results and achievements, whether it's patient care or the quality outcomes, engagement, employee, and or we called healer engagement. It really was more of an organic shared identity. And I think going back to maybe the origin of your question is it was easy. I believe that those who work in healthcare enter healthcare for a reason. They could probably tell you the moment in which they thought healthcare may be for me, or I want to be a nurse, I want to be a physician, I want to be a PT, I want to be a PT tech. I just want to get a feel for what it's like in a hospital setting, a clinic, whatever it might be. They could probably pinpoint that one moment or that one person that they had an interaction with, and that is what I call the sacred calling. So we are now called into an environment where we're all working together, regardless of title. We're all working for that one purpose, and that's to restore the brokenness. And it doesn't mean make whole, it means to restore that brokenness, to offer hope to our patients and to those who work in the field. So the sacred calling, I think, is vitally important. And then how we show up, how we're present for our patients and for those we work alongside and across the organization, that's vitally important too.
So good. There's a lot in there. You talked about values and you saw me step away. Maybe I grabbed my book that was close by. The first chapter in my book is Target Check Your Values.
There you go.
And unscripted, you talk about values as being the most important thing. I believe that's too. That's why it's the first chapter in my book is we got to get values right. And we have to understand the behaviors that model those values. And then we have to do frequent, what I call target checks. How are we doing? How are we living those up? And then we use those as anchor points to hold people up and accountable to those. So let's talk about that with you. I want to come back in a minute. I want to ask you why did you choose healthcare? We'll come back to that.
Sure.
But staying on this topic of values, what do you do with a high performing executive? I'm sure you've had this at least once in your life. A high performing employee, high performing leader, maybe they hit the targets, right? They hit the operational metrics, they get results done, but they refuse to adopt this as what you call healer culture, the culture of our organization. Maybe they violate our values of the way we treat people, whatever that may be. Do you protect their performance or do you terminate them for being a misfit for the values? How have you handled some situations like that in your career?
Those are truly challenging situations, and you're correct to identify it. It's one of those things, performance, no margin, no mission. We all have heard that, and it's true. You truly need to have that margin. But culture eats your strategy all day long. We've heard that saying as well. And so without the right culture, without being able to impact one's behavioral standards, the way one holds themselves or interacts with others, you're going to erode and harm that culture. And that will have a lasting effect, and that can harm the organization overall, which will harm performance. It will disenfranchise those that report to and through that person, or they see the disconnect. And so that dissonance across the organization is palpable. And so I always found it important to identify when that's happening, to sit down and have those conversations, especially if they are a C-suite leader. That's my responsibility. This is what I'm seeing. This is what I notice. This is what I think. This is what I want. Are you able? Are you capable? How can we get there? And giving that opportunity to them and working through it. I believe I know the answer to this, but I believe you believe in executive coaching. And that's another opportunity. If someone's struggling with that issue or those behaviors, then giving them opportunities to hold up a mirror and be reflected, their behaviors being reflected back to them through 360-degree surveys, evaluations of themselves, and personality assessments, but executive coaching about how to overcome those challenges. What are the deficits and how do you overcome them? Here are the tools. I want to embrace that performance, but I also want to shape those behaviors. And so there will come a time if that doesn't improve that person, that leader probably needs to move to an environment where that's more readily embraced.
Yeah, that's so good. We do a lot of executive coaching here at Harbour Resources. Let's talk about coaching for a minute. You were an athlete, so obviously
Mhm.
you had coaches in your life. Maybe talk about the importance of coaching to you. Share an example of maybe a blind spot you had that an executive coach, the importance of executive coaching in your life to work through those things where maybe I talk about myself a lot, Richie. I grew up in a home that was very violent. dysfunctional, abusive. I left home. I always say, and if you're watching on screen, I always say when I'm in front of people talking, I had left home with zero ability to communicate with other people. I just didn't know how to do it. It was all violent, loud, corrosive, condemning, what was modeled to me as a kid growing up. And so I had to learn. You see somebody who is a very polished communicator today, but I had to go to work on that, right? I had to get some coaching and some training. And I told somebody yesterday, a CEO I was talking to, if you knew how much I spent every month still today on coaching, your jaw might drop, right? Because I'm still a work in progress. But I had to
Absolutely.
go to communication was, I believe I always say there's two competencies as leaders that there's a lot of competencies we have to develop, but one A is emotional intelligence, one B is communication. If we don't develop those two, nothing else matters, right? We've got to get better. So where has coaching benefited you in your leadership? And what would you say to those leaders out there that are listening today about making that investment in themselves?
Sure. It's vitally important. And I highly prize that opportunity to learn from an expert who can hold up that mirror, who can clearly, concisely, directly provide that criticism, the constructive criticism, or just flat out, no, you're wrong. You're wrong about that. And calling the balls and strikes and telling me like it is. That's vitally important because, again, I mentioned that it's lonely at the top, especially in the CEO role. And so having someone who can, again, hold up the mirror made my life, made my role as a CEO more effective. So not only at work, but even at home, because how I led in the workplace probably reflects and did reflect how I led in my household. And so it benefited me on the personal and professional level. So I encourage anyone interested in advancing their career to be open to that coaching and then to be truly present throughout, because it's one thing to nod your head, affirm, move on, see you next month, whatever, see you next week, and move through your coaching sessions. But to truly transform yourself as a leader, you have to be willing to listen. You have to be open to that feedback. You have to be willing to then reflect that back to others that you interact with as well. And sometimes that means when you're a bad actor or you've harmed someone, that you've got to own up to that. I always encourage that ownership and then making amends, whatever that might look like. So you own it and you move on. Again, building that transparency and accountability and trust. The end game is trust.
Yeah, that's so good. I often say, Richie, I've been happily married 34 years because of coaching. My wife's been happily married about 10 of those years.
Yes. I did, and that's great. I love that. And I want to say you are the prime example. If anybody needs another, based on your own testimony here today, if anybody needs an example, look at Mike Harbour. You stated where you were and where you've come. You have podcasts, you have books you've written, you do coaching, you interact with organizations, you help them to see how to avoid what you have had to overcome. So congratulations on that. We're all malleable if we're willing to invest.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I don't do this to toot my own horn, but I share that to not to impress people, but to impress upon them. Man, if I can do it, if
Right.
I can do the things you just mentioned, we're running up on 500 episodes of the Lead Up podcast. I've given thousands of speeches. I've interviewed tens of thousands of people. If I can get to that place, if you went back and talked to some of my teachers growing up, like Mike Harbour did, they would all be surprised, right? Because again, the Lord, like you, did a work in me, first of all, but also putting the right people and getting the right people
Yes.
around me has helped me. So let's go a little deeper on this topic though.
Okay.
We, because we're human, we have our comfort zones, right? We're creatures of habit. We want to retreat back to what made us comfortable. So as you said, we can give lip service to a little coaching and yeah, I did that, but then human nature says, I want to go back to my comfort zone. So we can talk about this with culture or individuals into one. What are some things that you as a CEO challenge your team to do to measure behavior change, like to track? I'm a big believer we got to change our thinking first. Then we have to change our behavior, then the results follow. But how did you talk about a lot of this in your book, putting things in place to really move the needle? So I'll let you just go where you want to go with that.
I'm sure you've heard the saying, you inspect what you expect. And so there's constant communication about the expectations for that person, that department, that the organization overall. It's what I tried to communicate with the board as well for my performance and the hospital, the health system's performance as well. But you inspect what you expect, and you don't just let it pass slowly by. Now, I will say COVID really made that hard to do. It was just chaotic. And so some things slipped a bit. We lost our focus for good reason on a number of priorities for the organization or for patient care for that matter, because we didn't know what was coming, what was next. Knowing what you work, you planned your work, and then you work your plan, and you hold people accountable to that. And I always liked to ask for that feedback as well for my performance, how I can do this better, how can we do this better. And I liked having co-creators in whatever that might be. We wanted to be the first Joint Commission certified program for the state of Oklahoma. Then how do we do that? And what's it going to take? And then we would set about the business of building it together. And you have a co-ownership in that process, co-authorship in that process. And so building leaders is the same way. You share your expectations, you measure those expectations, and you hold them account and ask for the same back. I was never above their feedback as well. So how do we do this together? How do we achieve the outcomes that we desire? And then find the resources and the tools to make it happen. That's another thing. The training and the education that goes behind all that we do in healthcare is vitally important. You have to give them the tools to be successful. And it was my role as a CEO to be a waymaker. What's the vision? And a chain breaker. What are the barriers to you being successful? And that went all the way up and down the organization, all the way across the organization. How can I help?
Yeah, that's really good. Love it. You talk about love in your book and four types of love. And I think love is important. John Maxwell, I'm a John Maxwell junkie, as you and I talked about. I've had the pleasure of sharing the stage with John and getting mentored by him. And before I started studying John, I read my first John Maxwell book when I was 23, 24 years old. But before I started studying John, Richie, I didn't really love people, right? I like to lead. I wanted to lead people, but I didn't really love people. I loved results. I wanted to get stuff done. I wanted to look good. And I heard John say one time, he said, you can lead people, you can love people without leading them, but you can't lead them without loving them.
Yeah.
And that was a game changer for me, right? Because first of all, as a leader, I think I had to do some self-inspection. Did I even love myself? I don't think you can love anybody until you love yourself. So I had to do some self introspection there and learn to love myself as a leader and love where I wanted to go and create a kind of a vision for my leadership. But let's talk about love in leadership today and what that means to you. And maybe you talk about this term agape love that you write about in your book.
Yeah, I can completely agree. We have to be able to love ourselves. I believe that's vitally important to achieving our optimum self. And so I mentioned how important that is in my faith, and God gave his only begotten son. John 3:16 is true so that I, as a sinner, could be forgiven, that he loved me that much that even a sinner like me could be welcomed into his heavenly kingdom. That's the level set for me. And so again, that faith forming myself as a person, personally and professionally, I took that in the organization. The concept of agape love was not something we put out in a policy. It was my own personal belief. It was something I would talk about. And that allows us, agape love is the ability for us to love others without expecting anything in return. And so whether that's the patient in the bed or that's the homeless or unhoused person on the street, recognizing those needs, loving that person, offering some help where you can within your resources, within your means, and expecting nothing in return. And I believe that's something that we do in healthcare every day. When that vulnerable patient comes into our presence, then it's up to us to recognize them no matter what their walk is, no matter what their state, their condition, their ability to pay, their education, no matter what it is, we are called to be there, to be present for them, to extend that love. So again, we can be a part of that journey to restoration. That's, and in the healer culture, that's the one thing that, again, without putting it in policy or rubbing it in someone's face. It is the fact that if we have a sacred calling, and that calling itself, the foundation of it is love. And we can work through that in the healing process.
Yeah, look, this sounds great when we're talking about healthcare. I believe we need more of. I think if our healers, if our team just loved each other a little bit more, loved other humans a little bit more, our patient safety, our patient satisfaction numbers would improve. I think there's a huge gap there. And I don't mean to step on toes there. I believe that. I think we need to do a better job in the world of looking in the mirror and saying, okay, am I really loving people the way I should be loving, especially in healthcare? I think it begins there. But
If I could, I'll tell you a
yeah,
quick example, if that's all right.
absolutely.
In my book, I talk about one of our nurses. Her name is Sheila Monson, and Sheila, she was a healer in the organization, and she decided through her experiences that human trafficking is something that she really wanted to address. And Sheila put together her thoughts and her ideas, and she received some training, and she was really passionate about acting in that space through the ER to identify those who may be being trafficked.
So good.
And so she put into place all of her training, came back, presented it, and moved forward and put into place new protocols that allowed us to identify and help those who appear to be being human trafficked. So he didn't need me to create a policy for that. All she needed was permission to be a healer, to embrace that love, to embrace that passion so that she could take it to her workplace and then transfer that love, that passion, that deep conviction to doing what's right by others, for
Yeah.
others. All she needed was permission. And she did the rest of it and did remarkable things, made a significant difference in our organization, and particularly for those oftentimes mostly women that she identified and helped recover and save from that terrible destiny.
Yeah, that's so good. It's a great example of stepping outside of ourselves and loving others. Let's get back on the mat.
Yes,
I
let's
want
do
to
it.
wrestle something with you when it comes to leadership, because you and I 100% agree on the idea of agape love and healthcare. Let's turn it to a leadership conversation. You define agape love as being sacrificial without expecting anything in return. Sounds great. Now I'm a leader.
Yeah.
I'm expecting a return from my people, right? I need results. I need them to move the needle. I need them to lead other people better. I need turnover to get better. I need retention to get better. I need patient experience to get better. I need expenses to reduce. I need these things as a CEO. So I'm expecting a return when I'm paying somebody a paycheck. How do we balance that with agape love when it comes to leading others? How did you do that? What did you find as successful for yourself? Because I think that's a real kind of a conundrum that we face as leaders. I want to love people, but I need something in return. I need their best effort in return.
That is not easy. That is extremely difficult for leaders in these times. Healthcare is difficult, and there are no two ways around it. In a public trust entity where I led previously, there is a deeper conviction around serving the community. And you have, I don't want to say maybe the best word is latitude to really be committed to the mission of the organization. There are other organizations that are for-profit space that matters less. They do the right things, but responding to the community is not necessarily their highest priority. Whereas in a public trust entity, that often is the highest priority. Whether you are a safety net for the community or communities surrounding you, you're open to them and you're helping them. I'll take you back to COVID. And one of the conversations that we had during COVID, what do we do? My peers and organizations all across the country were reducing their workforce by 20%. They were stopping any contributions to retirement, their 401ks, et cetera. There were harsh things that were put into place. In our organization, with the board's guidance, we didn't let one of our healers go. We stayed open, we stayed committed, we reassigned them, we reworked them into roles across the organization, and we didn't make those drastic cuts. Now, it had an impact. It had a financial cost. And that was difficult. We didn't know what the future was to hold. How long would the pandemic, how long would COVID be upon us? And we kept thinking it would be over. It's over this year. It's over with the vaccine. It's all of those things. So it came with a cost, but we committed with the board's support and encouragement. We committed to keeping those people in the organization and working toward the mission and our shared purpose. So you respect them there, you respect the work that they do. Again, you inspect what you expect. So you need to push them to achieve the outcomes. Doesn't mean you don't have your reductions in force. It doesn't mean that you have to shave hours. It doesn't mean that you look at all pay and all of those things. You have to do the hard things as well. How every organization reacts and responds depends on that leader, depends on that board structure. But I always like to respect the individual, to recognize that it's not just a person that you see in the hallways. It's someone with a family. It's someone with bills. It's someone with hardships in their lives. And every decision that you make will impact that person and their family. And so always measuring that, the cost of those decisions, but remembering why you're there, and it's for the betterment of the patient and through those who care for them.
So
I
what
don't
was
think
that
I fully
confidence
answered your
in?
question that way,
Yes.
but it's a hard
Yeah.
one and we struggle with it all day, every day.
Yeah, look, I'm a believer that we can love people and still have a high expectation.
Yes.
Look, I have 2 adult kids now. I love them. I love them hard. I had high expectations. My son works for me today. He believes what I believe. He has a bar of excellence that's maybe even higher than mine
Yeah.
in a lot of respects, right? But I held him to a high bar. I held my daughter to a high bar. I think we have to, when we truly, this is just Mike Harbour's opinion, Richie, is why I wanted to get in this conversation. I think agape love is, yes, if you want to call it servant leadership or whatever it is, we need to serve people, but we
Right.
also serve people better when we set real expectations for them and hold them. I think loving people is holding to an expectation. We're doing people a disservice if we don't do that, especially when it comes to a team. I don't know how many employees did you have at Norman Regional, right? Allowing one employee to live outside our values or not meet expectations is allowing 2,000 employees to do the same.
Right. You're right.
Quint Studer said it once, what we permit, we promote, right? And so, again, I think we have to continue to work on that, love people, serve them. I think leadership is all about that, but we have to love them by holding a high bar as well, which is a good segue into something you write about. Pressure is a privilege, or pressure becomes privilege. You write about that in your book. Talk about what you mean there and maybe apply it to some pressure testing you had to do around some topics we've talked about already.
Yeah, sure. That was, I mentioned the calm confidence that I tried to possess. I felt I did, and the discipline to return to purpose through all the chaos. And the tornado is a great example of that. And the pressure immediately I wasn't at the hospital when the tornado hit. I was on my way. So I was watching the destruction as it moved across in front of me on the horizon. And I fully expected for there to be casualties, injuries at a minimum, but I expected death from what we were seeing, hearing, and experiencing on the way. And I get there in amazement, and providentially, there were no lives lost inside our hospital. There were some minor injuries, but no lives lost. That was a great release or a relief for me. Immediately, I began to think about what do we do next? How do we get these patients from here to there, get the care they need, and then respond to the needs of the community? Because that blue sign with a white H represents trust. It represents confidence in an organization that they will be there at your time of greatest need. And so we were caring for patients who were walking to our facility for care, and we had walls missing. We had a car on the roof. It was terrible. So the pressure to react appropriately was tremendous. And then in the days that followed, how do I react and respond? How does the organization react and respond to those in the organization who no longer have a work home to go to? And how do you respond and react to the community who is at a significant loss and their hospital's been destroyed? So that pressure, I worked to, and the entire organization worked to restore or offer some stability and restore that hope and that trust. We called it hope and healing, and immediately began working on temporary facilities until we could get that final permanent structure rebuilt. So we did that through communication. We made connections frequently. I would walk the streets. I would show up at the destroyed building daily and interact with the community. And then I'd go out into the businesses. I'd go to the chamber. I would go wherever I could get audience to hear their concerns and then to communicate what our position was. And I didn't do that alone. It was all hands on deck. Everybody who was capable was leaning into that effort, but it was communicating, being transparent, being vulnerable. And those times, those minutes and moments that you are in those employee only meetings and you're talking about the loss and you're talking about the devastation, you're talking about what you don't know for the future is, that's a tremendous pressure you've got to deliver for those people. You have so many people counting on you. And so you do that again by being present and really trying to close that loop. You circle back and you tell them what you've learned. You ask them if it was correct. You seek that understanding, but you communicate, even if the answer is no, we can't do that today.
Yeah. Look, I'm a believer that the real leaders show up, in a
Yep.
crisis, right? And you certainly showed up. I know you'd only been there, what, your second day, maybe, or your second Monday
Second Monday. Yeah.
is what you
That's
write. So hadn't even had a chance to make an imprint on the culture at that point. But I know you were part of it was a same organization you'd have been a part of.
yeah.
But what I am a believer in is that the leadership that you showed during that made a difference, right? And the culture that was there made a difference. And that's why culture is so important, because it shows up under pressure, right? Our values show up under pressure.
Yes,
Let's
they
talk.
do.
I want to use this to kind of come back to something you were talking about earlier. Where does purpose play a part, and how do we win? Look, this is I think a term we throw around a little too much today is PTSD. Not that it's not real. I think we all have some of it, but PTSD opportunities in a situation like that. You had healers in your organization. They don't even know if their family's okay, right? A
Right.
major tornado had run through and they're at work and they're expected to stay there and maybe not go home and check on their own family and maybe can't get a phone call out, right? And during this time, we didn't have, I guess this happened in 2013, so cell phones were around. I was thinking back to the Oklahoma City bombing. Cell phones weren't as prevalent as they are. But how do you use purpose to bring people to what they were there for and keep them from being distracted from all the other things?
What was interesting to me is that I talked about the healer identity being revealed to me from the rubble. It was there. It was just a situation that revealed what was inside each of those employees. And it was that what later became that healer identity. We didn't have that before the tornado. It just was revealed from the rubble. Their excellence, their commitment, their passion, their desire to help others was revealed over and over again. The PTSD is real and it was significant. And I tell a story in my book and people can read more about it, but we had 4 nurses who stayed and protected an actively laboring mother who couldn't be sheltered with everybody else, was separated from her family, could not be sheltered with everyone else, had to stay up on the second floor.
Incredible
4
story.
nurses, yeah, stayed with her, protected her, prayed over her, and then when the tornado hit, the walls ripped away and they can see the highway just on the other side of the parking lot. That's bravery, that's courage, that's a deep commitment, that's the agape love that we were talking about. But those are stories that last with you. And we worked very hard to begin that healing, the hope and the healing. And we did large group counseling. We had sort of town halls for those who were directly impacted. We had those whose houses were destroyed while they were there protecting others and serving others. And we worked to raise money, raise funds to give them that shelter. But we all just rallied together. And even still, even with that, as we absorbed those 300 employees into the larger, broader organization, we still found that they weren't perfectly comfortable in their new work home. Their work home was back in Moore, and we were asking them to do their work in Norman, and we made it work. But it was a hardship for them. It was a hardship for the organization. And we just pulled together. It wasn't perfect. It was not perfect, but what it was intentional. And we did not let them hang on to those stories. We encourage them to share with others, to be a part of those groups, and then identify where we could if they needed individual help.
Yeah, that's good. You used the term, the Tuesday test.
Yes.
You have a chapter called the Tuesday test in your book. And when I was reading your book, it was just really enlightening here. We are trained as healthcare practitioners, healthcare leaders, we're trained to perform really well under pressure.
Right.
Maybe even we get addicted to that, right?
We
In
do.
some respects. And healthcare really thrives in crisis situations. But then Tuesday comes, right?
Mhm.
Tuesday test. Talk about that with our listeners. What do you mean by that? And how do we prevent the letdown, the fallback, losing focus of what we're after when the crisis is gone?
In my book, the Tuesday test, it could be Wednesday, it could have been Thursday. I chose
Sure.
Tuesday because on Monday there's a crisis. You show up to work and you're short staffed, or you have a patient whose heart rate plummets and now you've got to go into your code blue. You have a crisis in the PICU or in the NICU, and we're built for that. We are ready to respond. Boy, we spring into action and our training kicks in, and it's like you're training in the army as a medic. You drill that over and over again. It's just second nature. We are built for that. We're trained for that. And we get this sort of adrenaline rush when that all happens. And then things return to normal as far as normal goes. And then we wait for that next crisis. And so I try to make the case that if Monday is a crisis, then on Tuesday, an average Tuesday morning, no patient is crashing, no hardships in the organization, no threats that we know or detect. And what do we do when there is no crisis? It's not pumping. And we oftentimes, again, we were built toward that chaotic moment. So the Tuesday test is, how do we remember how we are present? How do we remember that we apply that agape love or that sacred calling to Mike, has been in and on a unit for 3 days and is about to go home? How do you become present for you in your discharge? How do you help prepare the patient for the next step? And so it's just more or less a reminder of how you come together on those off chaotic moments, and you build a culture that allows you to pursue that excellence day in and day out without an emergency.
So it's a great transition to getting hacked, which you write about in your book, right? And getting hacked is having some systems in place, not the term getting hacked. There's a lot to, I always say, man, if those hackers would use their skills to do good, the world would be a great place, right? But
Right.
this is what you're talking about in your book, getting hacked, using some tools and systems to get better as an organization. So talk about talk about your hacking formula here and some things you recommend, and so that when we get back to that Tuesday where it is normal, but we got to keep striving for excellence and do things as well as we did them during a crisis.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that. The hack is the healthcare assessment culture kit. And really what it is, it goes back to your question about measurements. And we all know that without that margin, we have no mission. So we have to achieve excellence in the stated goals, in reducing our costs, and in driving volume, or improving our patient satisfaction, our patient experience, and the healer engagement, employee engagement. So we in the hack tool is something that the acronym that I came up with, so we can assess the organization based on those measurements. And part of that is, an example is turnover. And so there might be times in which you're losing nurses and you do an assessment, you do an exit interview with that departing nurse, and you learn a few things. And then typically your HR department is very good to capture and write those things down. But what are you doing with it, and what have you learned from it? You might think that a nurse or one of your healers is leaving because the hours are long, or the pay is, they can make more money across town, when the reality is they aren't given the tools. We haven't recognized their efforts. We haven't acknowledged their efforts to be present, to make a difference, to serve in that process of restoring hope and healing for the patients. So it's a tool that would allow you to come in, look at your metrics, and identify where are the opportunities. How do you score in terms of a culture or values based approach to driving those outcomes in the end?
It's good. Yeah. So listeners, if you're wanting to learn more about that, I recommend going to Amazon and grabbing a copy of Richie's book. We'll also make sure, Richie, we drop a link to your website so you can learn more about the healer revolution. I want to, as we land the plane here, I want to go back to this. You used the term healer many times, and you're using that term for our employees, right? What many people call employees in healthcare. Why did you coin that term? How has it impacted you as a leader? How has it impacted engagement and results in those organizations that you've led by just making that small but vital transition from calling a person an employee to basically an employee is a paid slave oftentimes, right? And to use a crude term, but I love how you've coined this term healer. How does that make a difference? How has that made a difference for you and the organizations that you've led?
I mentioned before that we were building the plane as we were flying it. I didn't come in with a blueprint as the CEO and say, this is healer culture, A, B, C, D through Z. So we were learning as we went along and things resonated. And it was a very organic way that we arrived at the term healer. As I mentioned, it was revealed to me in the rubble of the tornado. I couldn't put my finger on it exactly, but over time I understood. It became more and more clear to me. And I started using that term, especially as we were preparing to restore services in the community of Moore. And I would use it out in the community in presentations and the way I would describe our organization and our employees, and it resonated. And so that identity, again, it's that identity is optional, but the values were non-negotiable. The behaviors were non-negotiable. So we could have called it anything, but healer resonated. It resonated with me. It resonated with the organization. It resonated in the community. When the board says, how are our healers doing A, B, or C? You know, that's become, again, an organic growth in and through the organization. So
Or
it
what the kids
allowed,
call viral today, right?
yeah,
It
that's
went
right. That's right.
viral.
Yes, it did. It truly did. And in the community, and people would come up and say, one of your healers was so sweet to my father. You feel it, you sense it. It was there. And so having that shared identity allowed us to more readily create that shared purpose, easily identifiable. Everybody is a healer. That means we're working toward these things. And then beyond that, having a shared identity, it allowed us to break down silos because you're no longer the nurses did this or the RTs did that or housekeeping this. We're all healers. We're in it together. We have that
Love it.
shared purpose. And there is research that supports that when you have that shared identity, that silos begin to come down more easily. So that's why we grabbed onto it. It really was organic. It was intentional, but it was organic at the same time. And that's why I wrote the book is I wanted to give voice to those who believed from the beginning or maybe came to it later on, but those people who demonstrated what it meant to be a healer in healthcare today was really important. And I wanted this book just to give them voice so that the rest of the world could see what they revealed to me.
Yeah, love it. I love the unity, right? And one of my values, my company values is united. And I try to look for ways with all my customers that I work with. How can I unite with their
Right.
cause? They got to be values based. Number one, for me, that's one of the first things I'm looking for. But how can I unite with their cause so that I can speak the same language? And I love that you guys coined that. So look, Richie has shared a lot of great ideas in his book, full lots of meat in your book, Richie. Practical
Thank you.
ideas. I love practicality. The book I wrote, Quit Losing Talent, it's just lots of practicality. But I always say there's 3 or 4 or 5 ideas in my book that if you implemented, that's all you need. You don't need to practice all 20 of them. Just practice these 3, 4, 5 of them, and
Right.
you'll do really well. And so I want to give you a chance here, looking back on your experience, now that you've written a book and you've lived the experience from the book, what's the 1 or 2 practical ideas that you would say to the listener today? If you grab a copy of the book, go to these ideas, learn how to implement them that made the biggest difference in your leadership and your culture with the teams that you've led.
Yeah, great. I think this book for me is a small part a memoir. I didn't I felt people need to understand who I was as a person so they could better understand who I was as a leader. So I go through that a little bit in the book. But really, the key is how they relate to that concept, that shared identity that we just talked about, that shared purpose. And when you are attempting to restore the soul of healthcare, because we've become so transactional, I believe it's vitally important you start with the person with that individual heart and the way you can relate to that person to help them to do their things that they love to do for the patient. You help them to do that better, then you're going to be more effective. So I mentioned that those employees, those healers stand in the gap between the hurt and the healing. And we were intentional in giving them the objectives, providing that identity. And so I would say be intentional. We were assembling the plane as we were flying it, but you don't have to do that now. There's a great framework that comes from the book. Be intentional, embrace that agape love. And it doesn't mean anything more than you're willing to give of yourself in a loving way without expecting anything in return. You open up your side, so to speak, to help, and your heart to help others to heal. Start with that. Be present as a person, as a healer, as a coworker, and that allows you to be present as a person at home as well. So look for those opportunities to be true, to be transparent, build trust, to recognize that you are meant for more in this world than just showing up to gather a paycheck.
So good. Last question.
Yes.
25 years of healthcare leadership, 25 years plus. How's your thinking changed? What's different about your thinking as it relates to leadership than when you started 25 years ago that you think somebody, maybe a young leader needs to hear today?
Oh boy, that's a hard question. It's hard to say. Technology is happening is developing so rapidly around us. And so we have to be open to the use of technology. But that's not the only thing. We have to be open to new ideas, new thinking that allows us to achieve the goals that have not gone away. And that's to improve the lives of those we serve, the health and the wellness of those we serve. So gosh, it's hard to put a pin in that one, but embracing technology, being open to that technology and never forgetting why you are there. For you and I, having been in healthcare, I went to work every day so I could improve those lives, that I could make a difference in the lives of the patients that we are serving. And then more broadly as a CEO is how do I support, how do I show the way and break the chains so that healer can do their job more effectively. So I don't think that goes away. We still have to be able to relate to our patients and we still have to be able to or be willing to make a difference. I don't have a panacea and I would be open to what you would think that panacea is, but showing up every day, doing that hard work, committing to the patient and seeing them to get toward their goal of restoration.
Yeah, so good. Look, John Maxwell said, leaders know the way, show the way, go the way. You reminded me of that quote when you talk about leadership is about being a way maker and a chain breaker, right? And that's a little scriptural, right? That
Yes.
for us, he was a way maker, showed us the way. He breaks our chains from things that tend to hold us back. But I love that. I just want to make sure I leave you with that. I really picked up on that, Richie, and appreciate the way you've made the way for healthcare and healthcare leadership to be better in our industry and helping break some chains. We got a lot of chains to break in
We
healthcare.
do.
I think there, we got to get back to the love of healthcare, right? This agape love. We got to get back to the heart of leadership while also being focused on results. We've been talking about employee engagement and patient safety for 30 years with pretty much zero change in that. There are some pockets, organizations that are doing fantastic of that, but I believe we got to start with our thinking, right? We got to start with our thinking about leadership and we got to change our behaviors. We can't just work and do the same thing we've done and hope that it gets better. So this conversation has been very helpful. I want to challenge our listeners, go to Amazon, grab a copy. I'm showing it here on YouTube, The Healer Revolution, Richie Splitt, How to Restore the Soul of Healthcare. Richie, thanks for getting on the mat with me today, man, and sharing ideas and leadership philosophy somewhat from someone who's walked the talk, so to speak, in the business. We'll make sure that we share Richie's website and LinkedIn links in the show notes. So if you want to connect with him and learn more about him as well, you can do that. Richie, thanks so much for being a great guest on the Lead Up podcast.
Mike, I've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed wrestling with these ideas and these thoughts today. And thank you for your service to our country, and thank you for the service to our industry. You're doing a remarkable job, and I really appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity for me, but getting those words, those ideas, those thoughts out to the rest of the world is vitally important, and you're doing an excellent job of that. So thank you.
Thank you.